How's it going? Kevin Cleary here with a book review for you. If you're used to watching The View from the Pew or maybe knife reviews or something else, this is going to be a little bit different. I hope you enjoy it, and I want to give you some background as to why I'm making this video about this book. I don't do a lot of book reviews unless I feel fairly strongly about something, and so I've got I want to talk about a book called Total Truth. The book is by an author named Nancy Pearcey. And the book addresses some really important stuff, specifically a very prolific cultural phenomenon that all of us, to some degree or another, often fall into. And what the author would like to suggest, what Pearcey would like to suggest, is that we stop doing this. And what she's talking about is this divide that we set up in many of our lives, and really as a culture, this divide that we've bought into on a larger scale. Okay, and the divide is between that which is sacred and that which is secular, that which is more personal and that which is more objective. All right, now let me define this a little bit for you so that you can understand what I talk about the rest of the book. Pearcey, talks about the sacred-secular divide. You could talk about the faith-reason divide. Francis Schaeffer talked about the line of despair, and certain things were upper story things and certain things were lower story things. Okay, all of those ideas are driving at one main concept, which is we divide our lives into certain things that are more opinion-based, that are more personal, that are more subjective, and then other things that are more reality-based, or that we think of as more reality-based and more objective-based. Now, the reality is we don't observe these rules very well. It's just sort of this weird construct we've come up with in our culture. But let me give you some examples. Certain things like education, like politics, like science, or what is commonly called science, things like our business practices or our actual job. These things are all placed on this side of the line, on the objective, reality-based, reason-driven side of the line. Okay? Other things, however, like especially religious faith, morals, values, sexuality, all of these things are placed on the objective, the subjective or personal opinion-based side of the line. And we pretend as if these two can never meet, okay? Now, the reason that's a problem is because, number one, these two things meet all the time, okay? We're often, number one, we need to be more empirical. We need to be more logical and reason-based when we think about our morals, our values, and our faith. But we also have to admit that the reality is, when it comes to politics, when it comes to what we do for work, when it comes to our business practices, many times those decisions are not as objective as we would like to tell ourselves. Okay, so here's what our author suggests. She says, number one, we get rid of the divide altogether. We scrap it because it's completely imaginary. Number two, we start applying reason and logic to all areas of life. So we begin to examine our decisions and our choices from a reasonable standpoint, and we do that across the board. Okay? We furthermore admit, especially for a Christian person, we admit and accept that God's will for our lives affects every aspect of our lives. So we have to apply what we know to be true from Scripture to what political party we align ourselves with, what candidate we vote for, what we do for a living, how we conduct ourselves within that job that we have, how we raise our children, how we treat our spouses, how we act in traffic, how we interact with our neighbors. Everything on both sides of the line must all come under one heading, and that is faith drives all of it, is what Pearcey is suggesting. Okay, and I totally agree with that, and probably many of you watching will agree with that as well. Although I would challenge you, when you read the book, you may find that you're not as consistent as you think. Okay, I know I certainly wasn't. So that's what the book is about. The book is about this divide that we seem to have constructed in our culture, where we put certain things on the reason-based side, on the objective-based side, certain things on the feeling-based and subjective-based side of the line. And what our author is suggesting is that's nonsense, okay? And I think she makes a great point about that. Now, let me actually get into, now that we've got quite a long introduction going here, 4 minutes. You know what? I don't apologize for that at all. This is going to take 10 or 15 minutes anyway. I wanted you to have a good handle on our subject matter. Now let me kind of talk about the book in general, or sorry, that was general. Let's talk about the book specifically. First of all, the author, Nancy Pearcey, she's extremely capable in this area of study, okay? She traces the sacred secular divide that we've been talking about through history, through philosophy, through theology, and she does a great job, and her training is very, very good in order for her to address this. Oh, by the way, and through science and, you know, biology and physics and all of this. So the reason she's so well suited to do this is because both her undergrad and her graduate work have been in history and philosophy. Next, in terms of her training in science, she was a science writer and continues to be a science writer for many, many years. Starting in 1977, she worked covering, you know, new scientific developments for a publication called the Bible Science Newsletter. May not mean that much to any of you, but the point is more her experience, and she's continued to cover those kinds of things as a writer throughout her career. So she's very, very current on what's going on in the cutting edge of science, in the cutting edge of biology and chemistry and genetics and physics and astrophysics and cosmology and paleontology. So she does a really good job of staying current on these things, and she's able to address a lot of subjects from all of those different disciplines throughout the book. And so because of her previous training in philosophy and history, because of her very, very current knowledge of, you know, science and technical fields, she comes to the book really, really well prepared to address the things that she wants to talk about in terms of this divide that we have created. Okay, now she divides the book into 4 parts. Part 1 is the sacred secular divide. Okay, part 2 is creation versus evolution. So this is an application of this sacred secular divide, where she says, no, we need to apply science and reason to human origins. And when we do that, we find that evolution is fairly lacking. Okay, creation versus evolution. Number 3, history. She talks about history, and she talks about how did we fail to develop a worldview. And what she means by that is, historically, Christianity has been okay with having faith over here and everything else over here, real life stuff over here. And she said that was a poor way of doing things, and historically we've been somewhat guilty of doing that. Instead, we need to say, no, Christianity is pervasive. It affects and influences every area of my life, and there's nothing that I say, nothing that I do, nothing that I involve myself with that is not impacted by who I am as a Christian. That's part 3. And finally, part 4, she calls this part worldview thinking, and here she tries to make application and say, okay, if you accept her premise that our faith needs to be pervasive, then what does that look like in real life? Now, I will say this last part is very heavy on stories, and she has some great stories there, but when it comes down to real sort of practical steps, it's a little light in that area. Okay, that would be about the biggest weakness, and I want to get that out right at the front. One other weakness that I want to point out that I kind of skipped over is Pearcey is... there are 2 things that are going to influence the book, okay? Pearcey is a fairly strong disciple of Francis Schaeffer, and she's a fairly strong Calvinist, okay? So you'll see those things come into play as you read through the book. And there are some places, especially when she talks about human reason, where that kind of clouds what she's trying to say and confuses the issue a little bit for her. And it makes perfect sense, okay? From a Calvinist standpoint, human reason is depraved along with every other part of humanity. And so you can't depend much on it. But then, of course, she's going to argue that we need to depend more on reason to draw a conclusion. So it does put her in a little bit of a difficult spot, okay? So part 1 has been the sacred secular divide. And there she tells stories and addresses in detail some of the philosophical and practical aspects of what happens when we try to divide our lives into the sacred and the secular. And essentially she shows that it just doesn't work. Part 2, she gives attention to creation versus evolution, that debate that goes on, as well as offering some of the philosophical and moral implications of an evolutionary worldview. Okay, she does a great job in this section. This is probably part 2 and 3, in my opinion, are the strongest portions of the book. And, you know, they just explain a whole lot. They're able to trace the origins of ideas and influences of different, of many of the current thinking of today. Piercy traces the history of that thinking, where it came from, what people have said this before, and what has been said about those people. You know, sometimes she'll say, you know, look, this philosopher is highly influential today, but it was shown years ago that that philosopher was completely out to lunch. Okay, so there's some really, really helpful stuff in terms of philosophy and history in part 2, where she primarily talks about the debate between creation and evolution, and part 3, where she gets into history. Okay, part 3, she goes through history sort of just before. She doesn't go into ancient history that much, a little bit as she talks about philosophers, but mostly she looks at North American history, so we're only talking a few hundred years, and she traces the sacred secular divide through a number of historical events and movements, including the rise of evangelicalism. And one of the things she talks about is that within evangelicalism, there's been maybe an acceptance of this sacred secular divide, more so than maybe there would have been in other more traditional takes on Christianity, whether it be, you know, Catholicism or Anglicanism or whatever. All right, so she does do a really good job in that portion. There are points along the way here where she probably gives a little too much credit, where she, you know, she suggests that certain evangelical and restoration movement figures were completely sold on, say, common sense realism or some other main philosophical tenet. And as you look at them, there's a little bit of doubt, I think, on that area where you go, really, was that the only influence that was going on here? Or could it be attributed to something else? Then finally, in part 4, she starts to speak to how we move past the sacred secular divide, how we start letting God rule all of our lives, not just certain portions. Okay, this part she does a great job telling some really, really cool stories, offering some accounts from people who have made huge changes in their life when they start to think, hey, wait, I can't live in this divide any longer. Okay, and then she challenges us to do the same. There's a great quote that I think sort of describes number 1, the choice she wants us to make. Number 2, describes sort of one of the main tenets of the book as you read through all of it. And the quote is this: "The line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties, but right through every human heart." And so Piercy calls us to make a choice, to choose good instead of evil. And I would highly, highly recommend this book. I'll put a link to the Amazon offering of that book, whether it be the ebook or the other. And I'm not suggesting you buy it from Amazon, it's just so that you can actually get a look at the book. Now, I want to offer a couple of other books that I would suggest reading along with, or maybe even before you get to Piercy's book. The first one and most important one is Francis Schaeffer. This is the trilogy, and so in this Francis Schaeffer book, or in this volume, there are 3 books: The God Who's There, Escape from Reason, and He's There and He's Not Silent. So this little volume, Francis Schaeffer Trilogy, is amazing. Okay, very, very good book. I would highly recommend reading this. And of course, I've already pointed out that Piercy is highly influenced by Francis Schaeffer. In fact, she spent time at Libri with him, studying personally for a while in her younger days. The other book that deals with some of the same issues is this book, The Gagging of God by D.A. Carson. D.A. Carson in this book just does a phenomenal job of dealing with a lot of the sort of philosophical worldview type of stuff that's pervasive today in our culture. So all of those books that I've talked about are highly valuable along those lines. I would add one other, which is C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. Again, it addresses some of the same ideas, and I think all of those together give you a good background with which to approach Piercy's book, which is, by the way, totally excellent. So there you go. I have labeled some weaknesses there. remind you to be aware of those theological and philosophical biases as you read through the book. I would recommend that you read at least a little bit of Francis Schaeffer before you get into Piercy's book. And there you go. What are we at? 15 minutes now. Thanks for watching. I know this was a little longer, but this is kind of a complex subject, so I wanted to take the time and energy to deal with it properly. I hope you enjoy the video, and we'll talk to you soon.